Joining us, Dr. Kamaya. Thank you everyone for attending the session. Dr. Christy Kamaya is the chief shelter medicine, is the chief, is the chief of shelter medicine at the Humane Society in Silicon Valley, where she oversees shelter and medical operations. You can learn more about Dr. Kamaya's accomplishments. Please check out her bio under the speakers tab. Today, she will be sharing how Humane Society Silicon Valley completed the Association of Shelter Veterinarian Guidelines for Standards of Care. If you have any questions during the presentation, just go ahead and type them out and we will ask them as we are going. Welcome, Dr. Kamaya.
Thank you so much for having me. So about 5 or 6 years ago, as a shelter, we as HSSB, we dared to do what we thought was probably impossible, and that was meeting all of the guidelines put forth by the ASV. The guidelines for standard of care in animal shelters was published by the ASV just over a decade now. I first started at HSSB in 2012, and at that time, the guidelines were still relatively new, and not a lot of shelters were taking it seriously yet. But I did do a shelter medicine residency at the University of California Shelter Medicine Program, and that was where I learned about the shelter guidelines. And I view the guidelines as a way to improve the care in our shelter. And at that time, there wasn't any shelters that we knew of that met all the guidelines. So I asked the shelter medicine folks, Dr. Hurley, over at the UC Davis Shelter Medicine Program, like if she knew of anyone who was doing this. And she did not. And so as far as we knew, and as far as anyone else knew, no one knew of any shelters who were working on this. And I found that interesting. I found that kind of curious, made me wonder why others weren't doing it. So I looked into it, and I looked at what it would mean for us to actually go through the guidelines. And a couple of years after that, we delved into this project. And in the next few slides, I'll talk about that journey we went through, taking on the not impossible. And if I can figure out how to advance these slides, maybe. There you go. Okay. So Humane Society Silicon Valley is located in the San Francisco Bay Area in Northern California. We're a private nonprofit founded in 1929, and we have one small animal control contract with one city. It's the city of Sunnyvale nearby. Prior to the global pandemic, our annual intake was about 7,100. But since the pandemic, our intake has dropped about 18% and we landed right at around 5,800 this past fiscal year, which just ended July 31st. Of our total intake, 67 were transferred from other shelters, about 21% stray and 5% owner surrenders. About 55% of our intake are feline, 43% canine, and 1% other species. And kittens, I think like most other shelters, they're our highest intake at about 42%, or about 2,400 of our total intake. And looking at our transfers, so of our adult dog intake, about 74% of them were transfers from other shelters. 86% of our puppies are transfers, and 25% of other species of transfers, and about over half of the cats that we get in our shelter are transferred from other shelters. We transferred a total of about almost 3,900 animals. And without these transfers, our intake would have been right around 1,800 if it was just through our animal control contract. So that just gives you a little bit background about our shelter. And for our agenda, what we'll talk about, I'll talk a little bit about the ASV guidelines, just give you a brief overview. We'll talk about our plans to achieve the guidelines, how we did that, why we did that, and then go into how we executed on meeting all of the guidelines. And then I'll talk a little bit about afterwards. It's been a few years since we've completed the guidelines, so I thought I'd include some stuff about our learnings and some of the stuff that we're doing now and into the future. So the guidelines, what are the ASV guidelines? So as I mentioned, this document was published back in 2010, and it really was the first attempt to create some kind of minimum standards for shelters. So there is no umbrella entity that oversees shelters across the country. There's no regulatory body at the national or federal level. Some states might have some requirements and some certifying and things like that. But for the most part, it's not, there isn't. So as far as, minimum standards of care, it doesn't exist. And it didn't exist before the ASV guidelines. And really it is a tool that you can use, any shelter can use as a self-assessment for your own shelter and a way to help you improve your processes. It does promote the highest standards of care. And the intent was to provide some consistency of care. So of creating a standard and making it consistent across the board, regardless of the type of shelter you're in, a municipal shelter, a private shelter, or anything in between. This was meant to be applicable to any of those types of facilities. It is also used as a reference material, a benchmark, and it is a living document that is evolving. So it's been about a decade since the first edition was published. And just about a year or so ago, the ASV created a new task force to go through the guidelines and to review the guidelines and publish another edition with updated information. This document is created by experts across the country in various different specialties and disciplines, and it is really based on evidence-based material research as it's available, and all of this information is put together in a way that's easy to read and easy to use for anyone in a shelter. The guidelines are divided into 12 different sections, and the guidelines give recommendations on various levels, from the unacceptables, shoulds, musts, or ideal. So it's one of those four recommendation levels, depending on the urgency or the importance of that particular guideline. So it's pretty easy to read. Why do we need standards again? So this idea has been around since the founding of ASV, and this year is actually the 20th anniversary of the creation of this Association of Shelter Veterinarians. I can't even believe it's 20 years old. It's super cool. But what we do know is that, and what we do recognize, that there's a lot of information coming out there. There's a lot of research happening, and this field, I always thought of shelter medicine as being in its infancy, but it's 20 years old now. So it's, it's evolved, it's grown. Things are done differently, and we're constantly learning new things in shelter medicine. And this is a way to allow shelters to get better, to look, especially shelters wanting to look for ways to get better. There is also a higher expectation by society. It's not okay anymore for us to take in all of our animals and then euthanize the healthy animals. Our society, our communities, they're expecting more, they want more, and we're responding, and we've evolved to be focusing on more live outcome versus, versus being just a repository for stray animals that then get euthanized, which may have been the case in the past, but that is becoming less and less tolerated in many communities. And so this gives shelters the opportunity to change and to also evolve and to make the changes, the positive changes that will increase the life-saving impact. During that time, there were also various events going on in the sheltering world where shelters that mean well and want to do well, but perhaps don't necessarily have an understanding of various shelter medicine concepts, unintentionally cause more harm to animals. And so we hear of stories about shelters turning into hoarding situations, or severe outbreaks of infectious disease causing morbidity and mortality, things like that. Historically, shelters were designed for holding a large volume of animals for a very short period of time. So this goes back to the rabies control days decades ago, where they were built for the maximum efficiencies: stainless steel cages, concrete chain link, double-sided kennels that made it easy to go through and clean. And it really was created for convenience and how quickly you can get through and clean and feed everyone, and not necessarily taking into account the physical and behavioral needs of the animal. And so, those are some of the things that we'll be talking about. Our shelters have changed from a very short-term holding to being held longer and longer in the shelter. And the longer you hold an animal in the shelter, the more the needs of the animal need to be addressed. And so I'm not just talking about the physical care of the animal and the physical health, but also the behavioral, the emotional, the mental health of the animal as well. All of those things need to be taken into account the longer you hold an animal in your shelter. So it is not okay, it is not appropriate to keep your cat in a stainless steel box indefinitely, hoping at some point it's going to get adopted. The providing good care for your animal encompasses all of it: the physical, behavioral, emotional, mental health of the animal. And finally, for shelters, as I mentioned, there are a lot of shelters out there that have good intentions. They want to do the right thing, and they want to save the animals, but there might be a lack of training in basic husbandry or sanitation, infectious disease control, and, as I had mentioned, the behavioral needs of the animal. So what this allows us with the guidelines is to create an environment for shelter animal that does not cause undue fear or anxiety every single day. Because it's no longer acceptable to have sick dogs and cats in the shelter as just a normal part of operations. And, as I said, just keeping an animal in the kennel, it's not enough. We need to make sure that we provide for them holistically. And ultimately, what the guidelines gives us is this tool that allows us to give every animal the best possible experience during their stay at the shelter. So that's really what we want. We want the animal to have a really good positive experience while they're in our shelter before they go on to their adoptive homes or transfer to other shelters or wherever they end up. Any questions on the guidelines before we move on?
It looks like everyone got it.
Cool, fantastic. All right, so in this next section, I'll just talk a little bit of our plans for achieving the guidelines. So we get asked quite a bit, like, why did we do it? Why put all the effort into completing all of the guidelines? The short answer is because it seemed like a good thing to do, and why not? We could do it, and so there wasn't really a reason for us not to do it. And what happened those years ago, I was just kind of looking at the checklist. So I'll talk about it in a couple of minutes, but the UC Davis Shelter Medicine Program and the ASPCA separately publish checklists for the guidelines. So I was kind of reading through both of it, and just kind of glancing and checking off all the things that we were already doing or I thought we were doing. And when I got through it, it turned out we were already 87% of the way there. I'm like, oh wow, we're almost done. And so then I went back and looked at, well, which are the ones that we haven't done yet? And most of those were things like SOPs or formalizing processes and a few changes here and there. So I'm like, hey, this is not impossible. This is totally doable. Like, we could do this. This is not going to be this impossible challenge. And so that's kind of what got us to start thinking about it. Like, hey, if we're already 87% of the way there, like, why not go all the way? So we're very fortunate that we have a very supportive community. I proposed this idea to the rest of the leadership team and the board, and they were amazingly very supportive of this. I also presented it to our management team. We even played the length of stay game in one of our all staff meetings just to get the idea of people thinking about length of stay and what that meant. And also to get people engaged in this process. What I really wanted was not to have one other thing that our managers had to add onto their plates. And what we really wanted was a way to engage everyone, our staff, our volunteers, our leadership team, the community, to get behind this project and include them in this really exciting and really cool thing that we were going to do, the ASV guidelines. Like, we wanted to inspire people to be part of this and not look at this as a burden that this is just another one of community crazy ideas that now we have to do all the work. And that's not what we wanted. And so what was happening during that time, and this was back in 2015, 2017 was the end of our comprehensive campaign. And towards the end of our strategic planning that started several years prior to that. And so we tied the ASV guidelines completion to the end of the comprehensive campaign. So both of those things were going to happen and together, and that was a way that the guidelines could be included in the overall messaging of the shelter, and also included in the culmination of the comprehensive campaign coming to a close. So that was a really cool opportunity for the organization as far as fundraising went, and tying it to the ASV guidelines was super cool as well, and pretty beneficial to us. So what we ended up deciding on this, and once we got buy-in from everyone, that we decided this was going to be a multi-year project. And we wanted to empower our managers to take on this project and not feel like they were being overburdened with another thing that they had to do. And so really what we needed to do was we created in our action plan, we formalized the process. This wasn't just going to be a ops management team project. This is an organizational project. Everyone was involved. We incorporated this into our organizational goals, and we also created some expectations around, what we were going to do with the guidelines. We figured out a way to measure progress, and we celebrated some milestones too. We took these in little chunks because we knew it was going to be a really long time for this process to end, and not only a lot of people have that delayed gratification, and so having these celebrated milestones really helped in getting the momentum going. One bonus thing that we did have was we were able to, through a program called Encore, we were able to enlist the help of a retired project manager from one of the high-tech companies in town, who was making the transition. So a retired project manager who was making a transition into the nonprofit space. And so we were very fortunate where we were able to bring on board an actual project manager to help us with this, to help us with the ASV guidelines. And one of the nice things of having a dedicated person to help with this is that they were there keeping people accountable, keeping track of deadlines, and keeping track of various tasks going on simultaneously, and really just orchestrating the entire thing. And so our project manager doesn't like being being mentioned because he's very shy and humble, but we were very fortunate to have Phyllis, our project manager, who helped us with this. And I don't think we would have been able to accomplish this in the time frame that we had without her help. So here are the checklists. So one of the cool things is we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. There are two awesome documents out there to help you. There's two different checklists. One, like I said, from UC Davis, one from the ASPCA, and both of those you can download from their respective websites. What we did was we went and took both of these guidelines and created our own. So kind of what I did was mash those two together and created the spreadsheet that referenced both. And we were, in combining both of those, we ended up with 543 line items. If you're interested in this spreadsheet, I am happy to share it. Just let me know at the end and I can email it to you, or I can email it to our moderators, or however you'd like. So one of the things this allowed us to do was to really keep track of each one. And this was also tied to the following spreadsheet, the next page, which tracked everything. And so this tracked of everything that we did do, everything that we did not do. And this really kept us on task to be able to do everything. And this tool is super important for us too, because trying to keep track of 543 with like 20 different people trying to do various different things, it's way more than I can keep track of. But you know, anything that made this easier for us to track was super helpful. And this is, you know, several years ago, and you can probably do this in one of the online project management tools like Asana or something. But back then, Excel spreadsheet is what we had available. And when we were done, because there is no, you know, no certifying entity out there to prove that we completed all of these guidelines. And, you know, we didn't get a certificate or anything. We were just doing this because we thought it was the right thing to do. And so I did ask Dr. Hurley from UC Davis if she would come and bring her team down to audit our work. And she did. So there were some veterinarians from various shelters in California, the UC Davis team that came down and spent a couple of days here going through our 543 guidelines to, you know, to audit that we did do it, and we did do it appropriately. And we got this cool trophy, and we got a seal of approval from Dr. Hurley. So that was really cool. That was really meaningful to us. So meeting the guidelines, how did we do this? How did we get this done? So as I mentioned, there were 543 guidelines in total. And at the beginning of that year, back in 2015, we were already 87% of the way there, as I mentioned. And 87% doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot if you're spending a ton of your time, you know, writing protocols and whatnot. So we chunked it out. The first year, we made our goal of 93%. So going from 87 to 93% didn't seem like that big of a deal. It was still a lot of work, but that was going to be doable and something that we could accomplish. And it was a goal that was attainable. And then the following year, we went from 93 to 100%. And that's when we were complete. And that was our 2-year project. The way that we incorporated into our organization, our organizational priorities, is through our WAGs, our wildly achievable goals. So this is what we call our annual goals. So these are goals for the organization, goals for the department, goals for individuals. This is what we do on a yearly basis, where we create our WAGs and we look at what do we want to accomplish as an organization. These are the things that we want to do. And so it lists down, and it gives us a roadmap for what our year is going to look like, and what we'll be focusing on, what our priorities are. So we incorporated the ASV guidelines into our goals, into the WAGs that year. So I'll let you read that. our first WAG was, getting from 86 to 93, or sorry, that should have been 87 to 93. And then we created other WAGs to support that. So really, what we wanted to do was make sure, it's one thing to make this an organizational priorities, but you want to make sure that you have the resources available and you have the team available to do that. So having all these resources available, I mean, that's a huge part of being able to do that. And we wanted to make sure to do that, and which is why it was elevated to the organizational priority. So once we had our goals and stuff that we wanted to do, what do we start working on? And really what you want to do is you want to make the changes that are needed, not necessarily what's easy. So it is great to pick those low-hanging fruit when they're available, and getting those quick wins. They're awesome to keep momentum going and keep people engaged. But really, when it comes down to it, you need to change what needs to be changed, and really focus on that. And a lot of times, those things don't necessarily, they're not necessarily easy. They take a lot of work. And the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some highlights. These are if I were to pick the top two things that we did that had the biggest impact to our length of stay, to our animal flow, just to our overall life-saving capacity and improving that, it'll be the transition that we made from Kitten Nursery, having a Kitten Nursery on site, to transitioning that to foster home base, and also putting portals in cat cages. And I think for shelters out there, if there's one thing, if you can only do one thing, I would highly recommend putting portals in cages. So I'll talk about those things in the next slide. So why, so where to put these kittens? Prior to me starting at HSSV, we had an on-site kitten nursery. So this is where our little babies who weren't quite old enough to get spayed and neutered to go up for adoption, just they hung out in one of the rooms in the shelter. They hung out there, grew up for a couple of weeks until it was time. One of the downsides of having a kitten nursery like that, besides it's very resource and labor intensive, you don't have the ability to scale. You're limited to how much space you have, as far as being able to help more cats and more kittens. At that time, when we were doing the kitten nursery, we were still euthanizing a lot of underage kittens. If we couldn't find, if there wasn't space in the kitten nursery and we couldn't find foster parents, we had to unfortunately euthanize them. But we were very limited by the physical space. And anytime you have large volume of kittens, you're going to have infectious disease. So panleukopenia, URI, ringworm, all of those diseases, they're a constant presence. And so we were wanting to figure out a way to save more kittens, to save more lives, to be able to do more. And by just switching over to foster, that allowed us to scale exponentially. We partnered with our marketing team to recruit foster homes through social media, created training type things and classes and whatnot. But really the goal was to get the kittens out of the shelter. And our goal was to keep kittens in the shelter only if they were up for adoption or if they needed medical or behavioral care. If they didn't need to be in the shelter, we want them out of the shelter. They're much safer out of the shelter. They get better care in a foster home. And no matter how good your shelter is, it's still not a home. And so we don't have time to talk about this, but one of the things that we did do ultimately with the kitten nursery, with that space, that we were able to repurpose the space and our volunteers to support our under socialized kittens, or our little hissy spitty kitties, or the spicy kittens as people call them. We were able to repurpose that space to really focus on those. And I wish we had time to talk about that, but if you want to talk about that, send me an email. We'll go on to portalize. The other thing with portalizing cages, that was another big project that we did. And we took this, section by section throughout the shelter. We didn't do all of them all at once because we got some pushback on that. But we knew that cutting holes in cages doubled the living space for the cat. So it just by putting a hole in it, you've now doubled the space. It decreases stress. And we know that stress causes URI. So if you decrease the stress of the cat, you'll also decrease your incidence of URI. It also, and when you decrease your sickness, you'll see a decrease in your length of stay. So if you can move more cats through your shelter, you'll save more lives. And it's also much more efficient to clean with the portal than it is without it. You don't have to take kittens out and things like that. So it made sense, right? It makes sense why you would want to portalize cages, right? Actually, wrong. We had quite a few challenges to portalizing. So what we were up against is staff believed that they were already doing a great job, like doing a good job, life-saving and whatnot. And there was a real fear that the euthanasia rates would go up if you decrease the amount of cages. So just by cutting a hole in the cage, you decrease your functional space by half. And there's a misconception where people think the more cages you have in the shelter, the more animals you save. And that is absolutely not true. And it is a little counterintuitive, and it was a little challenging for some staff to really grasp that concept. But it's not about how many cages you have in your shelter. It's all about length of stay, your flow through, how quickly you can get your animals through. The more animals you can get through your shelter, even with less cage space, the more lives you'll save. And so that was challenging for our shelter staff to really understand. And basically what it came down to was, I promised, and I don't typically make promises, but I promised that we would not increase our euthanasia of cats. And because that's how strongly I felt about the success in portalizing cages. And that turned out to be one of the best things that we ever did for our shelter. We gave cats a choice. We decreased their stress. We decreased our URI cases. And so it's hard to see in this picture, but that's a picture of the isolation housing. That's one of our ISO rooms. It is completely empty. And our URI rate went down pretty significantly just by putting portals in all of our cages. And what that gave us the ability to do is to transfer in sick kitties. So here's a picture of the back of my minivan with cats from other shelter, with cats from another shelter. If we were treating cats that got sick in our shelter because they're so stressed out, we would never have this opportunity to help out one of our neighboring shelters and bring their sick cats to our shelter and treat them. And so that was one of the really cool things that we've done, and we continue to do that till now, where we have the ability to transfer in sick cats, and not just URI cats. We're also transferring kittens with ringworm, some really sick, potentially panleukopenia kittens, and broken kittens, and all kinds of stuff. We're transferring FIV, FLV cats, and the better that we get with our own processes, with our own efficiencies, with our own processes, the more capacity we build within our shelter. And if you remember to our first slide, our obligations with our animal control contract is like 1,700 animals a year. It's like less than 2,000. But we have this capacity of bringing in 7,000 animals. And we would never be able to do that if we weren't able to create our own efficiencies in-house. So, so going back to, if there's just one thing that you can do for your cats, put portals in your cages. It's much simpler now than it was back then. Back then we handmade every single portal with PVC pipes, but now you can actually purchase the ready-made portals with the covers, and it's super cool. So the focus has really been on cats because that's where the need was greatest, but we didn't want to forget about our canine friends here. And you know, we focus on housing for cats and giving them choice and giving them place to hide and a comfy bed, but really we want that for our dogs too. And you know, one of our managers had this brilliant idea of creating these double-decker Kuranda beds, and this has been fabulous. And our dogs now have a choice too. So some of our, or actually all of our adoption rooms, you know, there's a lot of glass, and it's great for people to view in there, but not all dogs want to be seen. And we were seeing that the dogs were kind of, you know, scooching up against the front wall to be behind, so that they're not seen. And you know, that can be distressing to the dog too. And so just by draping a blanket over this double-decker Kuranda bed, they have a choice. If they want to hide in their little cave, they have that option, or if they want to hang out on top, that's cool too. And so, you know, don't forget about your canine friends, even as you're focusing on the felines. So the biggest thing with our ASV guidelines was documentation. Like, you know, we were doing a lot of the things right already, but we didn't have it documented. So a lot of the 2 years were spent assessing, reassessing, rewriting, or writing new SOPs. And I think during that time, in those 2 years, we wrote 36 brand new SOPs, and it's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of SOPs, which I can tell you was super fun. But what we did do is, you know, we created templates for this, make it as easy as possible for our managers, and create a new repository where all of our SOPs live in one spot. And we made the template in such a way that we're able to reference which guidelines that particular SOP refers to or pertains to. And so that's really helpful for when we go back and revise these, because SOPs are not a one and done thing. You do have to go back and revisit, make sure that they're still relevant, because things change in your shelter, processes change, and you know, you don't want to end up having 10-year-old SOPs that really are totally obsolete. And so treat these as living documents and update them regularly as possible.
Dr. Kamaya,
Yes.
someone would like to know if you could share all the SOPs.
I probably, yes, I will figure out a way to show that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure thing. So as I mentioned, we finished in mid-June of 2017. We got audited mid-July, and some of our results, we stayed pretty much headcount neutral during that entire process. And so we did increase our intake over that time, but we got so much more efficient in the way that we were doing things that we didn't have to add any extra headcounts or extra staff at that time. We have since added, because now we're in a very different space. But we were able to, as I mentioned, increase our transfers from other shelters that we're, you know, a lot of infectious diseases that we are transferring and treating. So URI, we are doing parvo. We have a parvo treatment area, a program here, ringworm treatment program. We do, you know, a lot of complicated medical cases. We recently transferred in a diabetic cat, and surgical cases. We do quite a few non-spay neuter surgeries, both orthopedic and soft tissue. We've created new programs. We don't have time to talk about it, but FAVES is our foster animal vaccination station, adoption council. This is our program to make sure that our slow track or longer term residents have the individualized plans for getting them adopted, which usually includes some level of marketing and things like that. But most importantly, animals are given a choice of what they, of where they want to go, where they want to be, and they have a decreased level of stress as a result. So life after the guidelines, this was going through this process, it was an extraordinary learning opportunity for us as an organization, for our managers, and for our departments. And, as a result, we've become a very strong problem-solving, very highly collaborative team. We've learned how to work cross-functionally across various departments, across the entire organization. We've learned to solve problems, make meaningful changes, and I think the most important is this continuous learning process. We continue to learn new things and incorporate them for this continual improvement in the way that we're doing things. And this impact has been lasting. And even now, 4 years after we've completed the projects, we're still on this path of learning and evolving. So I'll just quickly go over some of the mission impact. So this is a huge, so this is comparing fiscal year 2010 to 2019. I would put 2020 in there to make it a 10-year comparison, but because of the pandemic, 2019 fiscal year was our last real year. We went from a live release rate of 87% to 95%. Our intake went from 4,500 to about 7,100, and we increased our intake transfers from about 1,100 up to about 4,000. It's a little bit lower, as I mentioned, now because of the pandemic, but we anticipate we're going to go back to those levels soon. And this is just, and we not only increase our live release rate here at HSSV, but also for our entire community. So we're part of a coalition in our community of our 6 major shelters in Santa Clara County, and collectively we have a 94% save rate or live release rate, which is incredible. Mission impact for our felines. Our intake went up since 2014 when we first started thinking about the guidelines. When our intake went up 32%, and we went from the 80 live release rate in the 80s to about 93%, even for our kittens now. And our live release rate for kittens are better now in foster homes than they were when we were caring for them in the shelter. And I found that pretty amazing and pretty interesting to look at the data into that. For our canine intake, our puppy intake went increased 4 times, 400%. And we were able to double our intake of dogs, of both dogs and cats, or dogs and puppies, in these past 6 years. And that's been incredible. And the reason we're able to transfer these animals in is because, as I mentioned, because of our internal processes and the efficiencies that we've created. We have shelters that we partner with in the Central Valley, where they are more rural parts of California with less resources and with a higher level of overpopulation. And so they have quite a few puppies in the Central Valley that we are able to not only take their animals as a receiving shelter, but also devote time and resources to help our partner shelters get to the root causes as well, and supporting them with them building their processes and their life-saving programs. And so what's next? So our plans after we were done with the guidelines, because you don't want to just stop, like you don't just do the guidelines and then you're done, you don't have to do anything again. It is, as I mentioned, it is a continual process. It is a a constant evolution. Animal sheltering is changing very rapidly, and really keeping up with what's happening, and also being able to be a resource to the community as the needs change. And so, as our community has changed and what the needs are, we also want to be able to respond to that and also be able to help. And so some of the things that we're working on, animal flow, I mean, we're always going to be working on animal flow. We're at 7,100 intake now. How do we even bring in more animals? How do we transfer in more? Our regional rescue philosophy, this is our transfer programs with various shelters. We focus on our community. That is our highest priority. But as our community need us less and less, we're able to expand out. And there are many shelters in California that need assistance, and that's really where our focus and our priorities are. Looking at behavior, animal human services, access to veterinary care, those are all things that are next in line for what we want to do. But then, 2020 happened. And I think like everyone else, we had to pivot and we had to change what we're doing very quickly. But for us, I think it was kind of a blessing in disguise with most of the animals out of the shelter and most of the people out of the shelter. And there was this newfound bandwidth with our management staff to take a few of those things that were on the back burner, or, were put away on the shelf, those projects and things like that, really look at it. And also as we pivoted in creating these new processes as a, reacting to the pandemic and its challenges, but really keeping in mind how we can put these, put the processes in place that we could then iterate on later when we have the time or have the bandwidth to do things a lot more intentionally. And so that's kind of where we have been, and it sounds like we still might be for a little while. We were just given a mask mandate today from our county, so we'll see what happens. But it is a new fiscal year. We have new strategic priorities, new goals and stuff, and things we'll continue to work on, expanding our reach regionally and beyond, and how we can continue to be a resource for a community, training the next generation of shelter leaders and veterinarians, and staying on the forefront of the sheltering evolution and continuing to be a resource for other shelters. And I think with that, we might have a couple of minutes for questions.
Yes, we do. Someone asked, you touched on it earlier, but is it common in most areas that improving shelter practices and accommodations for cats result in higher live release rates for cats and dogs? And is the reverse true?
So the better conditions that you can provide during their stay in the shelter, and the shorter length of time you can keep, or that, the shorter length of time that they stay in the shelter, the healthier your population will be. And, the more lives you can save. And, I think that the reverse is true, where, the longer you keep a cat, especially the longer you keep the cat in the shelter, the higher the risk of URI, because we know that URI is a result of stress. And when you have a bunch of sick animals in the shelter, they stick around for a while because you have to treat them, which means you can't take in as many. So absolutely. I don't know if that made sense or not. Please let me know if it didn't.
She asked, do cats have a higher impact than dogs? Example, does it make sense to start with cats in most cases?
I think so. The reason, the best place to start is looking at your data. Going back, looking at your data, looking at where are the animals at most risk. For us, the reason we looked at kittens especially, and the portals, is because kittens were they were the ones at highest risk for euthanasia at our shelter at that time. And many of those were underage kittens. And the reason we decided to focus on the kittens is precisely that, because they were at the highest risk at our shelter. And so by focusing on kittens and really focusing on life saving for kittens in our shelter, we were able to improve welfare for pretty much everyone else in the shelter. It was kind of amazing how that happened. But I think for I don't think anyone can tell you which would be better, which would have a higher impact. You should look at the data for your particular shelter and focus there.
She said that makes sense. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, are there any more questions? All right, thank you, Dr. Kamaya. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us, and we will be sure to forward any questions we have to you.
Absolutely, and feel free to send me an email. My email address is up here on the screen if you have any other questions, or if you're interested in the ASV Guidelines spreadsheet or anything like that. Feel free to send me an email. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great evening.
Take care.